Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special podcast episode. My name is Benedict Rhodes, and I'm a fourth-year journalism student at Humber College in Toronto. Over the past several months, I've been working on my thesis project, which is a long-form piece of journalism with an accompanying podcast, which is what you're watching right now. Over these past several months, I've been speaking to some of the top athletes, stakeholders, and changemakers in Canadian sports, learning about the legacy of the Vancouver 2010 Winter Olympics and Paralympics, the Toronto 2015 Pan Am Games and Para-Pan Am Games, as well as the potential 2030 bid to bring the Winter Olympics and Paralympics back to Canada. Legacy can be many different things, of course, both physically and culturally. Yes, things were built like stadiums and facilities to host the games, but there's also a legacy left behind after a major sporting event like that, which can't be measured in dollar figures or in square feet. Sports, of course, can bring people together like few other things can. Joining me on this podcast to relive Vancouver 2010 specifically and talk about the past, present, and future of Canadian elite sports is one of the greatest sports writers this country has ever seen, Mr. Stephen Brunt of Sportsnet. As people who know him well know, and as you'll find out over the next half an hour or so, he has some fantastic stories to tell, and I really hope you enjoy this podcast episode. Very excited now to be joined by one of the greatest Canadian sports writers ever, and someone who is integral to telling the stories of Vancouver 2010 and of our Canadian athletes. And I'm, of course, talking about Stephen Brunt of Sportsnet. Stephen, this is a real pleasure. How are you, first of all? And thank you for taking the time.
I'm great. I'm great, Benedict. Happy to be here. Happy to be doing this.
I guess before we talk about the 2010 games themselves, we need to mention, maybe how they came about. Like British Columbia for a long time had been, a potential host region for the games, but had fallen short on a couple of occasions for whatever reason. But that all changed in 2003 when Canada had been awarded the games by a pretty small margin as well. What do you remember about Canada being awarded the games, and how do you maybe remember how Canadians reacted to that news?
I don't remember the bidding process that much, to be honest. I think since Calgary '88, there had been, which was a successful games in a lot of ways, not necessarily in terms of the Canada winning gold medals, but was successful financially because of the TV rights deal jumped that year tremendously. So it was a bit of a bonanza. Plus, the facilities, had paid off in terms of, especially the Oval. That there had been a bit of a reward, a bonus for people outside of those games. So I think they were remembered very positively by and large. Now, again, some of the facilities didn't get used much. Any the ski jump was never really used again. But in general, I think there was a sense that the legacy of Calgary was a positive one, both financially and otherwise, and it kind of erased the memory of Montreal '76, which was obviously a huge smoking disaster financially. And then in between, you'd had the two Toronto summer bids that both failed, and that generated a tremendous degree of cynicism about the IOC and about the process, because that was at the height. Again, I'm not saying that they're not corrupt; they weren't corrupt later, but that was right at the height of the kind of the corruption in the bidding process, and all of those stories about IOC delegates showing up in Toronto and looking for all kinds of different favors to be done, while at the same time it appearing that absolutely that the fix was in on those bids, that Toronto had no chance to win anyway, that they were being played for suckers. So you had the happy memory of Calgary, you had a bit of a sour taste of that. But I guess what I remember most about Vancouver and again, this kind of is leading up to the games is, I think there was a degree of ambivalence, certainly. Obviously it had achieved enough public support and political support that the bid was carried forward and they eventually won. And there were some side benefits from that bid that had nothing to do really with the Olympics, but it was a way to get them funded, the Sea to Sky Highway and the SkyTrain to the airport. So there was this kind of tangible, well, at least we're going to get this. But yeah, there was still a pretty heated debate, I think, in the time between when the bid was won and when the games took place, about whether it was worth it, about whether the disruption was worth it, about dealing with the IOC and whether that was a good thing. That's healthy. That's a healthy thing, but that was certainly in the air in that entire period leading up to for that entire 7-year period leading up to the games.
Yeah, you mentioned things like the Sea to Sky Highway and the train and also other things were sort of created in the pre-2010 build-up, like the Own the Podium program, for example.
Yep.
How important are sort of legacy projects to hosting a successful 2010 operation, maybe how have they affected and impacted Canadian sports since then as well?
Well, the in terms of the kind of physical legacy stuff, like the highway and the SkyTrain, it's just kind of real politic, right? That sometimes you need the excuse to get those things. You say, well, why didn't we just build them? Because we needed them. But sometimes you need the cover of an Olympic Games, for a mega project to get that stuff done. I just think that's kind of political reality. It's unfortunate, but it's true. So at least it was a sweetener, I think, for people in the Lower Mainland for sure to get those things those things built. In terms of the Own the Podium legacy, yeah, it's been incredibly important. It changed Canada's approach to sport completely. Not just Own the Podium, but also B210, which was the private version of that, very kind of discreet, but it's the private money that went to funding specific athletes and their training. Part of the legacy of 76 and 88 was that we didn't win a gold medal in either games, and the only host country to not win a gold medal on home soil. And the truth, as athletes have been saying forever, is that if you want to win, you got to fund. That money translates to medals. It's just true that training opportunities and coaching and all of the things that can be funded matter. You can't just leave athletes on their own and with a carding system and expect them to succeed against athletes that are being way better supported than they are. So there was a real shift in attitude going into Vancouver to kind of, it was going to be guaranteed win night, that we weren't going to go through the process that we went through in 88, where you just kind of crossed your fingers and hoped that something would happen. And we're going to make it happen. And we're going to put our money not distributed evenly among all the Olympians, but to focus it on those that had the best chance to win, which, you can argue about whether or not that's a good thing, but if you want to win medals, it's the only way you win medals. So that was that was a sea change, really, in terms of how Canada prepared for an Olympics, how we funded sports, why we funded sports. That's and we're still again really living in that world now. That Own the Podium is whether the recent numbers in Beijing were what they were. There's a pandemic, there's all kinds of other reasons, but we're still living in an Own the Podium world in terms of amateur sport in Canada.
And in the lead up to 2010, you actually took part in the torch relay. What was it like to be asked to do that, and what was going through your head maybe as you carried that torch in Newfoundland, I believe it was?
Yeah, it was fun. There was some I was the one media person who actually admitted they'd done it or talked about it publicly, and I took a fair bit of flack for it. That I definitely wasn't the only one, and there were a whole lot of people in the Globe. I was working for the Globe and Mail at that point. We were part of Bell Globe Media, and I was working for the consortium, so we were part of the Olympic consortium. And one of the things the Globe did was had several of our people. The one I remember for sure is Roy McGregor, but there were a bunch of other people. We were going to write about the experience of doing it. But I guess I was foolish enough to stick my head up outside the foxhole and said, yeah, I'm doing this. And I became the guy who said, well, how can you possibly do that? Well, look, I eyes wide open. I know what the IOC is. I know what the torch relay is. I know the Greeks didn't invent it. The Nazis invented it in 1936. I know it's a commercial enterprise. I saw the Coca-Cola signs. I get it. But what I was interested in, and Newfoundland is kind of my other home, so I got to do it in a place that's important to me. I ran along with Keith Pelly, who was running the Olympic Consortium, and he also has got Newfoundland roots and came out and did it. But I was most interested in kind of the people I was with, who were in that little van, who all got their chance, and why they did it and how they felt about it. And to do it in a small town where everybody kind of turned out and lined the street in Pasadena, Newfoundland, and to hand off, to light the flame of a young woman who was sitting next to me in the bus, who was a school teacher, who, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but had kind of a tragic story, and she's no longer with us. But she was selected to do it, and she was an amazing person. And her husband and her kid were there waiting for her at the end of the day. It was really moving. Not because I necessarily buy into the whole Olympic mythology that is, in some ways a corporate creation, but just in the kind of the grassroots sense that I do think, I think the games, the athletes always redeem the games, and that that it matters to people. And there was a sense of pride too. There was a real sense of pride, local pride, provincial pride, national pride. Like I said, I'm willing to go there as long as this doesn't turn toxic.
And after 7 years or several years of preparation, the games finally arrive in Vancouver for a few weeks. Is kind of the center of the sporting attention across the world. But they didn't get off the perfect start, right? There was the incident, the opening ceremony. There was the tragic death of Nomar Kumratashvili. There was the snow issue that was suboptimal, shall we say? And I imagine that left a lot of people kind of scrambling at the time.
Yeah, it was. Look, I was there for probably. I was out in Vancouver a lot before the games, working for the consortium. So I was back and forth a bunch of times, and then I was out for the game. I think I was there 10 days before the beginning of it. And it's like the one thing I'll say, I've covered a lot of Olympics going back to Calgary in '88, and the mood in an Olympic city before the Olympics isn't always kind of pure happy excitement. It's never pure happy excitement. There's always dissenting voices. There are people who are grumpy. There are people who are saying we're going to rent out our house and leave for 17 days and make a bunch of money because we don't want to deal with the traffic and stuff. And there are people kind of waiting to say I told you so when things go wrong. Who for one reason or another have not been happy about the Olympics happening. And Vancouver, you had this, that all of the above, right? There was there were people who were didn't want the Olympics there in the first place and were kind of saying, look, this is going to be a mess. Look, we don't know what we're doing. We're going to embarrass ourselves. You had the tragedy at the track, which was horrible, and opened up a whole bunch of questions about safety. I remember the snow melting over. You could watch the snow melting off the mountains, which was always an issue. In the given Vancouver, given the climate. And then some glitches at the opening ceremonies, and there was a real pile on. People were piling on, and I think there is a little bit of a Canadian tendency occasionally to say, oh look, like we, in Barcelona they had a great, beautiful Olympic opening ceremony, but look what we did. That wasn't an artistic success. We don't know what we're doing. And you could critique opening ceremonies for a million different ways. And believe me, I've done it. But I think there was a fair bit of negativity. There really was. I'm not sure nationally, because I was kind of in the bubble within the city, but you could certainly feel it.
And you mentioned the I guess failure maybe to win a gold medal in Calgary and in Montreal, but then Canada got off to a pretty quick start with Alexandre Bilodeau winning on day 2, I believe it was, and the memorable scenes of him with his family as well. How important do you think it was to just get that out of the way early and just get that gold medal done?
Yeah, it was huge. I think a lot of us thought Jen Heil would do it on the first day, but in women's moguls, and that didn't happen. We were all kind of wondering who's going to be the first, right? Who's going to be the person? We knew, because you knew somebody was going to, and it wasn't like going to be like Calgary. Somebody was going to get one. They were going to get one pretty quick. But Alex, I think we knew a fair bit of his story going into the games, and the story about his brother Frederick, and that whole, and it's kind of, a perfect Olympic story, right? It's, that's got all of the elements, and it's, it's not like the whole world are suddenly moguls skiing fans. You're mostly most of the people, most of the sports of the Olympics, people are tuning in as tourists, right? They're not devotees of a lot of those sports, but what is it that draws people in? It's the being able to have a narrative, a human story, kind of, who is this person, and who is their family, and who is the guy cheering for him at the finish line. And it was kind of storybook, right? That he was the guy. And hearing, seeing the flag go up and hearing the anthem for the first time in a Canadian Olympics was, I think that set the whole Olympics in motion. And and I'm not saying it erased what happened before, because somebody died, right? You don't erase that.
Course, yeah.
But it did, the cloud kind of lifted right then and there, and it never really came back.
Yeah, you mentioned people love like a narrative, a feel good story maybe, or like a story that they can kind of maybe relate to. And I've had a few athletes tell me that Vancouver 2010 was maybe maybe that's maybe more prominent in Vancouver than it maybe was in Torino or other places before it. Like for example, Christine Nesbitt, for example, told me a story of her parents being like serenaded by O Canada when someone recognized her on a train, for example. What do you remember about maybe the seas of red that we saw in Vancouver as well, and maybe how the games played out away from the field of play?
It was it's like nothing I've ever experienced before. And so I was living right downtown. Yeah, and I'm working out at the broadcast center at the convention center there. So I was right in the middle of the city. And, like I say, 2 days before the games, you wouldn't have known anything was happening aside from, some roadblocks and stuff like that. But when it started, it just kind of popped, and suddenly it was, the streets were filled with all these people who were just blissed out, right? They were smiling and happy and, wearing the colors, and like again, sports gatherings can go the other way, as Vancouver knows well, because of the Stanley Cup riots, right? It can go sour, but it was, it wasn't an angry drunken crowd or a disruptive crowd. It was just, it was, I'd say people were just kind of high. It is, and I've never seen anything like that before. Like there's Canada Day celebrations, there's, patriotic occasions in Canada, I guess, but just this kind of unabashed, open-hearted, we're happy to be here. We're proud. We're having fun. Everybody loves everybody, it's the least, like I said, the least threatening crowd I've ever been in. And it just kept going and going and going. Like, again, you didn't necessarily have a sense in the middle of it what was going on in the rest of the country. That, only started to really dawn on us, I think, a little later in the games, that it was everywhere. But you had to kind of surrender to it, like it was pretty hard to be cynical about it at a certain point. It felt kind of real.
And there's a lot of happy drunken crowds, I gather, in Vancouver as well. Like John Montgomery, no less, walking through Whistler with the beer, and there's sort of the momentum, I guess, towards the end of the games, where Canada just kept going. And what do you kind of remember about that, and kind of the sort of happy times just kind of kept continuing?
Well, it was exactly that. It just kind of built, right? There was nothing to undercut the story and undercut the feeling. It just, everything kind of went right. And, not everybody won, but there were enough medals and there were enough great stories. And John Montgomery with the beers, like, that's kind of the perfect moment, right? It's the guys in a sport that, look, no one in Canada pays attention to that sport at all. A guy like him wouldn't have been a factor. We wouldn't be a factor in that sport without on the podium. And that kind of everyman scene in Whistler with the crowd was, I think people still get emotional thinking about that. It was that summed it up in a lot of ways. And it just, again, it's like you were under a spell. Everybody was kind of under a spell. And I think we were all working too. Like, again, we were all going into dark studios every day and doing our jobs. But if you were living in the city at that point, you couldn't help but get swept away. I was back and forth to Whistler a few times. Obviously, it was the same up there in a smaller space, but it just kind of swept up everything in its path.
And no less, of course, the Sidney Crosby golden goal, kind of the pinnacle of maybe Canadian sports, but especially of those Vancouver Olympics.
Yeah, and I it's funny, like the piece I did at the end of the Olympics was I actually did before that happened. And it was kind of like that, it almost didn't have to happen. Like, it also played out according to script. And of course, it's Sidney Crosby, scoring it plays out according to script. Like, you couldn't write it better than that. But, by the time, like, I think there's times when it's felt like it was all about hockey. And if we didn't win in hockey, what's the point of all this? We don't care about any of these other sports. Hockey's hockey. But, I think Canada could have lost that game, and it still would have, the feeling about Vancouver or Whistler still would have been pretty much the same. It kind of, the story had already been written then. It was just, it was a great ending. And it was a focal point. But I thought it was, the die was already cast by then in a lot of ways.
And you mentioned a couple of times, but what did it mean for you personally? You mentioned you've covered Calgary '88 and you covered Vancouver 2010. Where does covering a home Olympics kind of rank on your list of career highlights, of which there are many, I'm sure?
Yeah, it's Calgary was different. That was the first one I covered. I had kind of a peripheral gig with the Globe. We had a huge team in those days covering Olympics, and I was kind of writing the kind of edge of the Olympics column, not necessarily a sports column. And that game, that Olympics, it didn't have the same feel. Part of it was that back in the day, like they went to 17 days with the Winter Games, but they hadn't added all these sports, and so the calendar was thin. There are a lot of days in the 17 where there was nothing going on. And it just kind of stretched out. So it didn't have, no offense to anybody in Calgary, but it wasn't the same. It just wasn't. And, other Olympics, obviously, were highlights for me. Seeing Ali light the torch in Atlanta, Barcelona in 92 was an amazing games. Lillehammer in 2004 was an amazing, or 1994 was an amazing Winter Games in a tiny little town. So a bunch of them were great. Some of them were less great. But Vancouver was, I'll never experience anything like that again, just because it's convergence, right? A convergence of, what was going on in sports, what was going on in the country, what role I played, what my job was that year, the opportunity I had to be around it, to cover, and to cover a lot of the stuff even leading up to it. I never had that before, and I'll never have it again.
And you mentioned the piece at the end of the 2010 games, which I don't hesitate to say is one of the greatest pieces of Canadian sports writing I've ever seen.
Well, thank you.
You won a Gemini Award for it, of course, as well. What goes into creating an essay like that alongside producers and stuff, and be able to capture an event like that into just 4 minutes? I think it was.
Yeah, it was like we actually did one. I worked with Matt Dunn, who's a producer at TSN. So he was my partner on that project, on both of them. And we actually did one earlier in the games that nobody remembers. But it was about the similar theme. It was about this kind of new patriotism, this kind of trying to make sense of what it was, suddenly we're in this rah country, and when the Americans do that, we always kind of turned our noses up at it, right? We kind of think of them as hyper patriotic in a bad way. And yet here we were, and kind of holding the mirror up in front saying, wow, is this us now? So we did one earlier in the games, and it actually went over well. And Ken Volden, who's also at TSN, was the guy who encouraged me to do it. It wasn't really my gig. Like I was working for the Olympic website and writing a little bit for the Globe. So I had a writing job. I didn't have a TV job in Vancouver. And so this was a one-off. And the first one, just, could you write something and work with Matt and put some pictures to it and let's see what you can do. So we did that. And I say it went over pretty well. And then, things were kind of, there was this crescendo towards the end. And they said, well, look, you should go back and revisit this and see what you can do. And I think I knew what the theme was. Actually, Nelson Millman helped me out a lot too, who was the program director at the Fan in those days in Toronto I worked with, but also a guy who helped me in terms of learning how to perform, a piece rather than just read it, because I wasn't a broadcaster. And we threw like of all the stuff done at the Olympics, like that Olympic consortium had a lot of resources, and there were features that they spent tens of thousands of dollars, is probably is short. Like they put a lot into them. So what we did was like homemade TV by comparison. It was just two of us and an editor. We were the team. The music had a lot to do with it. Hey Rosetta, friends of mine from Newfoundland and folks I'd known for a long time even then. And they actually played in Vancouver during the Olympics. And my wife and I went out to hear them. And so I give her credit, Jeannie. She was, when they played Red Heart, she said, you should use that song next time you do one of these things. So she gets full credit for Red Heart because I think it makes the piece. And it just, it all just kind of fell together, And I remember when it first played that night, I went in and, talked with Brian Williams and introduced it, and they ran the piece. And it's like nothing I've ever experienced. I'll never experience it again. Like I turned my phone on and just, it exploded, and people in the hallways were applauding, in a broadcast center. Like that doesn't, your colleagues, right? Like it doesn't happen. And it just, it's kind of like, I couldn't explain it to you today, where that all, how we put it together, because it was just kind of, we just did it, right? There wasn't a lot of forethought, but it just kind of hit the moment, sometimes you get lucky. And I think Matt and I both feel like we just kind of caught it that day. And we're super proud of the piece. And people still talk to me about it, which is amazing. I've been doing this job for a long, long time. And that's the first thing that comes up still.
And one line in particular sticks out to me is you said, we didn't need to own anything. What mattered was the occasion. What mattered was the event, and what mattered was the excuse to wave the flag and sing the anthem. And I think that's kind of a theme of this podcast, but also of the games, as you mentioned. What is maybe the impact of an Olympics can have on a city and a country if people really kind of buy into it?
Well, look, I think I can deconstruct spectator sport completely and say it's meaningless, right? It's a empty spectacle. It just distracts us from our lives. It's a platform for commercials. It's and again, you can take apart the leagues and you can take apart the IOC and take apart FIFA. You break it down. You can be completely cynical about it and not be wrong. But I've come to believe, and maybe, sorry about the phone ringing here in my house, but we'll just ignore that. I've come to believe that, maybe it's a way to justify the fact that I've spent my career covering, or a big chunk of my career covering this stuff, that the value of sport, spectator sport, is that it creates a sense of community, that it allows, there's the opportunity to think or feel something collectively, which, and again, this over the course of time, in the course of my lifetime, the opportunities to do that have, again, we can all connect this way, but I think it's different. I think we all kind of live in our separate little bubbles a lot of the time now. And I think the idea, now again, rallying around a flag can be a bad thing. It can be a dangerous thing. Nationalism can be a bad thing and a dangerous thing. It's, as a force on the planet, it's mostly been negative, I would say. But I think there are moments when it's good to kind of pull together as a tribe, to say this is us. And, that can be your neighborhood. It can be your town. I live in Hamilton. I grew up watching the Tiger Cats. A lot of our identity was tied up in that. That was the only game in town. And, that kind of told you where you lived and, who your neighbors were and what, maybe even you ascribe a set of values to it if you want to keep going. So I think that matters. I've decided that matters. I think it's good. When the Raptors won a championship, I think that was a good thing for the city of Toronto. I think it was a positive thing. Not, our athletes are mercenaries and all that stuff, but I think that sense of everybody kind of caring about the same thing at the same time matters. And, where else do you get it now? You're not going to get it in religion. You're not going to get it through politics. You might get it through politics and, some ways that are a little more toxic, like the stuff we just saw in Ottawa. But, where are you going to get it in a where people kind of rally around something that is essentially positive and is uplifting. And it, kind of makes you look at the people around you and shake their hand and pat them on the back or give them a hug. And I know it's corny, but man, I actually believe that. So that's become my justification for basically everything I do. It doesn't apply to everything I do, but it allows me to at least believe that it's not all about nothing, that sometimes it's about something.
And I spoke to Alexandre Bilodeau for this story, and he mentioned kind of this big rise up to 2010 and then maybe a hangover after 2010 in the years prior in kind of the national sense. He said like that kind of brought everyone together, and then all of a sudden it was just over. Is that something you kind of felt as well, maybe?
Yeah, well, it hasn't been the same, and in part that's, like in terms of the Olympics, you think of the progression, right? Then it went to Sochi, and there were all kinds of reasons to feel whatever the outcome, whatever the medal count, there are all kinds of reasons to feel pretty grumpy about Sochi and who staged it and why they staged it, and the underlying doping system that they enacted, right? Like if you want to kind of make people kill their belief in the Olympic Games, I think Sochi went a long way to do that. And Pyeongchang, which felt kind of distant and middle of the night for a lot of people and not the same. And then this last one, a COVID Olympics, you can factor bring in the summer games as well, the COVID games last summer. yeah, it's not. It hasn't been the same. It just it. But I'm not sure. You know, even in the best of circumstances, it could have been the same. Like that's. I think that was a. I think Vancouver was a one-off. You know, like I'm not sure you could replicate. Even if you come back to Canada in 4 years, it probably wouldn't have been the same.
And in recent times, Canada has had chances to maybe bid for the Olympics, like Calgary 2026, for example, which kind of fell at the hurdle of the people of Calgary voting against it, essentially. Maybe why do you think it fell at that hurdle, and what is it maybe meant for those 88 legacy facilities and things that they were maybe hoping to rejuvenate?
Yeah, like that's a probably a that's a there's some local dynamics in Calgary that are part of that for sure. And some of that bid felt like a way to get an NHL arena built for the Flames. It felt like a little bit of a bait and switch from a distance anyway. But it's not just there. Like you look at Norway, like a country where all these sports actually matter, and more than anywhere else, and they rejected it by plebiscite, the Oslo Games, and obviously there's an economic discussion to be had. And I think there's that kind of growing feeling about the IOC and doing business with them. And do you really want to get in bed with these people? So I would think all of those things crept in Calgary. A lot of it, but a lot of it when you throw it out as a plebiscite 7 years in advance, a lot of it's just about money, and people saying, is it worth it? Is this where we should be investing our money? And it's pretty easy 7 years out to say no. It just is. There's way more reasons to say no than to say yes. So I think all of that kind of collided in Calgary, around that potential bid. Because otherwise, look, had they made the bid, they would have gotten the games. There's not that many countries bidding anymore for the Winter Games, and certainly not many democracies bidding for the Winter Games because, so they would have had it on a plate the same way, if that next Vancouver bid comes together in 2030, they'll get it. There won't be. I'm not sure though. I think there won't be any competition at all.
You mentioned 2030. There's kind of a recent announcement that they're exploring the bid, and as you say, they would be favorites. I think to get it. I think the only real competition I think would be maybe Salt Lake City, but I'm not sure where that bid stands either. You do think that Vancouver would be a front runner, and what do you think maybe a pre-games build-up would look like again in Canada?
I think they're a front runner. I think if we're going to stage games, period, like let's reuse these facilities before they're too old to reuse. Like the problem, again, part of the issue in Calgary was that you almost would have had to not quite start from scratch, but those legacy facilities, other than the Oval, weren't in very good shape, and you would have had to rethink it. Whereas the Vancouver Whistler facilities are there and they're usable. You're gonna have to build an athlete's village, but otherwise you shouldn't really have to build much of anything. It'd be nice if they could get that ski jump and turn it into a 12-month facility rather than a 2-month facility. But you have a ski jump, you have a sliding center. Those are the expensive things, right? You've got a hockey rink, you got 2 hockey rinks. So I think, I think that makes a lot of sense. I am intrigued by this whole idea of the First Nations, that it's a First Nations bid primarily. I'm not, to be honest, I'm still not sure. We've interviewed some of the folks involved in that. I'm still not entirely sure what that means. But I think if that is legitimate, and again, if it's not, if it's not just kind of a way to, like, a selling point, that's actually, there are actually some legitimate benefit that's going to flow through to First Nations communities. I think that's going to help. I think it's a smart idea if it's sincere, but I can't judge from at this point whether it's actually sincere.
And finally, a lot of the stories around Vancouver 2010, including a lot of the ones you've mentioned here, are about how the games make people feel and what the games maybe mean to people. What would hosting in 2030 maybe mean to you personally, and would that kind of should the games come back to Canada again?
Yeah, I think I think it would be. I don't know if I'll be working, but I think it would be. Look, I think it would be great. And again, this is without me combing through the fine points of the economics or the structure of the bid or any of that stuff. Which there may be red flags in there that I don't know about. Look, I'll tell you. I think we're going to have an interesting thing this fall. when Canada plays in the Men's World Cup, Soccer World Cup, for the first time since '86. And I think you're going to see something, the closest thing we've seen to Vancouver 2010 there, because it's a national story. It's a world game. It's a stage that Canada was on a long time ago, but in very different circumstances. I think you're going to see something 2010 like in November with that World Cup, and with all the flag, you're going to see people driving around with Canadian flags on their cars. You're going to see people transfixed by every match, and it's a super likable team. And John Herdman is a charismatic coach, and people are going to rally around this thing like crazy. Like I don't think it's people have fully processed what this is going to be, because that's actually the biggest sporting event in the world, not the Olympics. But I think when that happens, and Canada, whether Canada wins a match and advances or they don't, but just being there and being part of it and having that kind of big national sporting moment, I think that's going to also whet the appetite for another one. So yeah, memories of 2010, which are distant for some people already, and some people weren't alive then, and but I think the people who do remember it, and then they're going to get another real injection of that stuff in the fall with the World Cup. Yeah, I think people are going to crave that again, and want another opportunity for it.
And 2026 as well, of course, with the games,
and then a World Cup here, yeah, which is going to be again. I think if you'd asked me 2 years ago what that would be, I think I was happy about it and excited, but I thought Canada's participation as a host would be short and sweet and kind of a token. But anybody who's watched that side the last little while knows that that's not what we're talking about at all. That's a culture changer, sports wise. That absolutely. So yeah, it's going to be could be a pretty wild next 10 years.
Steve, it's been a pleasure to hear your stories and your insight, and I look forward to seeing you lighten another cigar with the Olympic torch. And it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Benedict. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you again to Stephen Brunt for his time and for his fantastic insight. And thank you for watching this episode. In the description below this video, I'll put a link to the story this podcast accompanies. The written story includes interviews with several Olympic and Paralympic champions, including Alexandre Bilodeau, Christine Nesbitt, Lauren Wollstonecroft, and Aurélie Rivard, among others, as well as former Toronto Mayor David Miller and Adam Van Koeverden, who's now a Milton MP, but formerly an Olympic champion, of course, in his own right. Thank you again to everyone who spoke to me for this story, and thank you for watching this company podcast episode.